In this Blender tutorial, I'll show you how to use Blender's particle systems for beginners. So particle systems in Blender can be used for many things, like creating fur or hair. You can also create rain or snow. You can create fireworks and other types of particle simulations. So in this video, I'll be covering all the basics of how to use Blender's particle systems, and I'll show you how to create some different things like emitting out the particles, bouncing particles off of other objects, making particles fall down into a scene so you could create like snow or rain. I'll also show you how to shoot out particles in certain directions. I'll show you how to use the particle system to distribute objects on another object. And I'll be showing you how to use the hair part of the particle system, and I'll show you how to add hair and how to comb hair and change the different hair settings. And I'll have detailed timestamps in the video description and the YouTube timeline so you can check out each part if you want to just check out a specific part about Blender's particle systems. Now real quick before we start, videos like these are made possible thanks to my Patreon supporters. So if you'd like to help support the channel monthly, joining my Patreon page is a great way to do that. And if you join my Patreon page, you'll also get access to lots of Blender content like 3D models and assets, tutorial files, artwork project files, procedural materials, geometry node modifier setups, and lots more Blender content on my Patreon page. And after this tutorial, if you'd like to get even more into particles, you can check out my particle system tutorial playlist. I have a lot more particle system tutorials, like how to create falling confetti, how to create falling leaves, how to make fuzzy fabric, a snow animation, fireworks, and even a fuzzy sphere tutorial. So here I am in a new scene in Blender. I'm just going to start by deleting everything, and I'll just go to the add menu, and I'll just start by adding a regular plane. Now to add particles, you need to select the object, and then you need to click right over here on the particle settings here on the side panel. Then you can click on the plus here to make new particles. Now you can rename the particle system if you want to, so I'm just going to call this like particle settings 1. And then if you want to add multiple particle systems to the same object, you can click on the plus here, and that's going to add a new particle system, and it's going to create a new particle. So the particle systems right here, these are different than this particle system. So these here are the different particle system slots which you can add to objects, and you can also click on this button here to hide it from the viewport. And then this here, this is actually the particle settings. So because I clicked on the plus here and made a new particle system, it also generated a new particle settings with all the default settings. But I'll just click on the minus here. We can just use the first particle system. Now you can see there's two different settings here. There's emitter and there's hair. So if I choose hair, you can see it's just going to generate some hair coming off of the object. And I will be going over the hair settings later in this video, but for now I'm going to start by going over the emitter. So the emitter is going to emit particles out instead of it being hair on the object. Now you can hit the space bar and that's going to play the animation, or you can also click on the plus here and the pause here to play and pause the animation. Now when I play the animation, you can see that these spheres are coming out of the object and they're just falling down, and that's because they are affected by gravity in the scene. Now if you try to render this real quick, I'll just go to the add menu, add a camera, and just hit F12 to render. You can see the particles are not going to show up in the 3D scene. That is because these here, these spheres, this is just in the viewport just to show you where the particles are. But if you want the particles to actually show up in the render, you're going to have to choose some sort of particle object to show where each particle is. Now right here there is a number, so you can turn up the amount of particles. This is how many particles are going to be used in the simulation. For now I'll just keep it to a smaller number, like maybe 500. Then there's also a seed here, and this really isn't that helpful for a random simulation like this, but you can change the seed if you want to. If you want to randomly change or randomly generate where they are, you can change that seed value. Then we also have a start frame and an end frame. So the start frame is when the particles start to emit. So because the start frame is set to 1, you can see it's going to start right here on the timeline right when I start to play it at frame 1. However, I might want it to be delayed by, let's say, 25 frames. So if I turn the start frame to 25, then if I go back here to the starting and hit the spacebar to play the animation, you can see the particles aren't going to start to fall until 25 frames. Now the end frame is going to be when they're going to actually stop emitting. So these 500 frames, they are going to be randomly emitted evenly through the start frame and the end frame. So for example, if I turn the start frame and the end frame to the same value of like 30, now when I play this, they're not going to show up at all. And then right when we hit frame 30, they're all going to come out all at once because the start frame and the end frame are the same. However, if I have the start frame at 1 and the end frame to a really big number, like 10,000. Now if I play this, just a few are going to come out really slowly because it's evenly distributing the particles coming out through the start frame to the end frame. Now having the start frame frame and the end frame at the same number can be super useful if, for example, you're doing something like a confetti animation. So in this tutorial, which I created a little while back, I created this confetti animation and we created some falling confetti. And so for that one, I want the start frame and end frame to be a little bit far apart, so the confetti falls throughout the scene. But I also made this exploding confetti, and for that I set the start frame and the end frame to the exact same value so they all come out at once. So that's where using the start frame and the end frame at the same value can be really helpful. Now when you play the animation in the timeline, you can see as it's playing there's this little red line here which is being generated. But then if I like change some of the settings, maybe change the number or move it around, you can see it disappears. So the red line is going to be a quick bake in the viewport. However, if I move something or change the settings, the bake is going to go away. So I have to go back to the start or just start to play it. And you can see as I'm playing it, it's doing a quick bake there. But this bake isn't going to stay there because, as I mentioned, if you move something, the bake is going to go away. So later in the video, I'll show you how you can use this cache setting here to bake the simulation to make sure that the simulation stays how it is. But just so you know, when I play this, that's just a quick bake there in the viewport that it's generating. Now, as I play the animation, if I zoom out here, you can see the particles are disappearing right down here. And that is because of their lifetime. So on default, the lifetime here is set to 50. So that means that once the particle system comes out, it's only going to stay in the scene for 50 frames. So if I start to play this, you can see it's going down, and then right here as it hits frame 50, they start to disappear, but you can easily change that. So for example, if you want the particles to disappear really quickly, you can turn this way down, maybe just turn it to like a 10, and now they're going to disappear quite quickly. Or if you want the particles to always stay in the scene, just turn it up to a really big number, and now if I go back to the starting and play this, the particles are just going to continue to fall down and down to the scene. Now you can also turn up the lifetime random. So let me turn the lifetime to a smaller value, just like 50, and then I can turn up the lifetime random all the way up to 1. So now when I play this, you can see some of them are ending down here, but some of them are kind of ending up here. So that just makes it a bit more random. And where this could be very useful is if you're creating something like a firework animation. So in my firework tutorial, I turned up the lifetime randomness, and that way when the particles are emitted out on the fireworks, they just kind of slowly fade away, and they fade away randomly at different times. And so that makes it look a bit more random and makes it look like a firework sputtering out. So here on the Emission tab, there's also this source tab, so I can open up the source. And there is this emit from type, and you can choose between faces, vertices, and volume. So if I change it to vertices, they're going to be emitted out from the vertices of the object. So because this plane just has 4 vertices, it's going to be emitted out here in the corners. If I change it to face, it's going to randomly be emitted out here on the face. And so that's probably the most useful one. That's probably what you'll use it most for. Now there's also this volume. And so if you change it to volume, it's going to emit out in the center of an object. So for example, if I just go into edit mode and maybe bring the plane down, then I can extrude the plane up. So now it's like a cube. Well, now if I play the animation, because it is set to volume, you can see that particles are randomly generated not only around here, around the mesh, but also inside the mesh. So if I go into edit mode and scale this way up, you can see particles are randomly being generated inside. So you can use volume. That might be useful for some things. For most things, I just use faces. Now you can also change the distribution, so there's jittered and random both have kind of similar effects, but you can play around with them if you don't like where the particles are coming out. Now as well as jittered and random, there's also a grid distribution. So if I turn it to grid, now you can see it's going to kind of come out in a grid. It's going to start in one corner and kind of go to the end. I don't find this super useful. I haven't really used it for anything, but this might be kind of useful for like some sci-fi or motion graphic animations. And you can also choose the resolution of the grid. So if I turn up the resolution, now there's going to be many more spheres on top of each other. And I can also turn up the random value. And now the grid is a little bit more random. But for most things, I just like turning the distribution type to random. So let's now close the emission type and we can open up the cache, but I'm actually going to be going over the cache later because baking the simulation is something that you generally want to do more towards the end of the animation. So I like to go through all these settings and kind of set everything up and then bake it at the very end. So what I'm going to do is close the cache and then I'll click here on these dots and I'm going to drag this to the very bottom because we'll be going over that later. Let's open up the next one, which is the velocity. So with the velocity settings, you can tell it where you want the particle to be shooting out at a certain angle or in a direction or at a certain speed. So right now on default, the velocity normal is set to 1 and the normal is the direction of the face. So if I just like click right up here onto these settings, I can turn on the face orientation. And so the outside of a face is blue, but the inside of a face is red. So if I just go to the add menu and just add like a monkey head, you can see it's all blue, but if I go inside it, it's red. So on default, the object objects are emitted out from the front of the face. So if I were to like rotate this, now you can see the particles are kind of being shot out here. And so this normal, that's what it's doing, is it's shooting out by the normal. However, if I turn this to a larger number, now it's going to shoot it out with a stronger amount. But then because there's gravity in the 3D scene, the particles are then falling back down. You could also turn this to a negative value. So if I turn this up to like -5, now they're going to go out at the back instead of the front because they're going in the direction of the normals, but they're negative instead of positive. So I'll just turn this to a 0 because I also want to show you the other settings. Now there's also this tangent here. So if I turn up the tangent, that is going to make it move along the direction of the face. So because the face's normal is pointed up this way, the tangent is going to be either this way or this way or this way, depending on the tangent phase. So let's just turn the tangent to like a 4. So now if I play this, you can see the tangent right now is going this way. However, if I were to rotate the phase, now you can see it's going out in this direction, and I can just continue to rotate the phase. And so it's going to rotate around. So you can sort of think of this as like it's sliding along the face. And let's just add like a sphere instead, maybe scale the sphere down, stick it here. Now if I play this, you can see the particles are coming out in a circle because the direction of the faces are going around in a circle. So that's the tangent, but I'm going to turn these back to 0. Now there's also this object aligned, and this is very useful if you just want to point it in one direction. So you can see there's the X, Y, and Z, and so the X is the red line here, the Y is this line going back and forth, and the Z is up and down. So if I turned up the X value just to like a 10, now you can see it's going to be shooting out on the X axis. Now why it's shooting over here is because I need to hit Alt R to clear the rotation of the object, but now you can see it's shooting out on the x-axis. Or I can turn it to a negative value, and now it's going to shoot out on the negative x. So if I want it to shoot out maybe like over here, I could do negative x and then y. So let's turn up the y and then go back to the starting and play this, turn this up here. So I actually need to make it negative. So you can see shooting it out in this direction is going to be negative on the x and negative on the y. Or maybe I want to shoot it up, so I can turn up the z-axis, and now it's going to shoot over in this direction. And to make it shoot straight down, you could turn the z to a negative value, and then that'll shoot it down instead of shooting it up. Now, if you turn on the object velocity, that is going to push the particles if the object which is emitting the particles is moving. So for example, I'll go back here to the starting and I'll move the sphere right over here, and then I'll hit the K button and I'll insert a location keyframe. Then I'll just move over by a little bit, maybe 25 frames. I'll move the sphere over right here, and then again hit the K button and add location. So as I start to play this, they fall down, but then as I move this over, they're still just falling down straight down. Whereas in real life, these would actually be pushed out to the side because the object is moving. So if I turn up the object velocity, let's turn this up to 1. Now when I play this, you can see it's going to push the particles over. So this way, by having the sphere move, it's going to actually push the particles around. So that's very useful to add more realism. Now there's also this random value, and if I turn up the random value, the direction which is going to come out will be super random. And this way, instead of it just falling out in one direction, it's going to just come out randomly by different directions. So that can be very useful for making maybe like some abstract things. So let's close the velocity, and the next one here is rotation. Now with the rotation, if I turn this on, right now we're just previewing the particles with the spheres here, so you're not going to be able to actually see the rotation because if they rotate, they're not actually going to look any different. So the rotation, I'll be coming back to that setting later. So I'll click and drag and drop the rotation right here. So let's now go to the physics. So we're going to open up the physics settings. So there is a mass here on the physics, and if I turn up the mass, each particle is going to be a lot heavier. And so actually, let me open up the velocity real quick and turn the randomize to 0 so they're not all shooting out at random directions. Let's close the velocity. So by turning up the mass, it's going to make each one of the particles a lot heavier. Now there's also this Brownian here under forces, and the Brownian is going to add kind of some random noise as it's falling or moving. Let's turn it up a lot higher to like a 200 so you can really see what it's doing. So now you can see each one of the particles kind of has a random movement. It almost looks like the particles are alive and they're kind of moving for themselves. So they are kind of falling because of the gravity, but they have a lot of Brownian, so they kind of have their own movement. Now the drag and damp are going to add more resistance through the air. So with the drag here, I don't really find that it does too much, just turning up the drag, but if you turn up the damp, you can see it really slows it down. So it looks like the animation is playing slower, but really what it's doing is it's having more air resistance. So it almost looks like it's falling into water or falling into like some molasses or honey. So it's moving a lot slower through the air. So we'll close the forces and we're going to open up the deflection. Now with the deflection here, this can make it so that it can bounce off of another object. So for example, I'll go to the add menu and I'll just add a plane. Let's maybe rotate the plane, stick it over here. And actually, let me just click right here on these settings and turn off the face orientation because we don't need that anymore. So if I normally just play the particle system, you can see the particles are just going through other objects. So to actually make the objects bounce off of another object, we need to click here to go to the physics properties and we need to turn on collision. This way, when I go back to the starting and play this, you can see they're actually going to bounce off of the plane. So that's very cool. So here on the deflection, there's a few different settings that you can choose. You can choose this die on hit, and this way when it hits something which it would normally bounce off of, like this object here, they're instead going to die, so they're going to disappear instead of bouncing. Now with this collision collection, you can choose a collection of objects and then it's only going to interact with that collection. However, you do need to make sure that the objects have the collision modifier. So if I were to like duplicate this object, move it over here, maybe have another object like this, let's select both of these objects. I'll hit M to move them into a new collection and we'll just call this like plane. We'll click on create. So now we have a plane collection. And then we'll add one more plane here. We'll just add another plane, which is also going to interact with them. But in this plane, I will hit M to move and I'll just move it back here into the scene collection. So now if I click back here to go to the particle settings, go to the collision collection, if I click here and just choose the plane, now you can see it's going to ignore this object because this object isn't in the plane collection. Now let's close the deflection and we're going to open up the integration setting. So with the integration, we have this time step here, and this is the main setting which you can use to change the speed of the particle simulation. So if I turn this way down to a really small number, you can see it's quite slow, or I can turn it way up and it's going to be really fast. There are some other ways you can change the speed of the particles, like maybe adding some drag. You could also change the strength of the gravity, but this is the main setting, so I'll just leave it at the default of 8.04. Now there's also this subframe here. If you want to turn up the subframe, it's going to add more frames in between the frames which are already there, and that way the simulation will be a bit higher quality and a bit smoother. But for most things I really don't need it, so for most things I just leave the subframe at 0. Let's close the physics settings and we can now open up the render settings. So here on render as, right now on default it's set to halo, and so these little spheres here in the viewport, those are the halo objects. But the halo objects won't show up in the final render. Now you can change the render as, so you can turn it to none if you want to, and now you can't see them. You could also turn it to like some other things like line or path, but I really don't use these. The main ones that you're going to use are either object or collection. So let's first choose object, and what I'm now going to do is just add some sort of object. So I'll just add like a monkey head, we'll scale it down and just kind of stick it over here. So now if I click back to the particles, make sure on the render you can change it to object, and now down here on the object tab you can choose an object. So if you click on the eyedropper or just click right here, you can choose the monkey head or just select the monkey head by using the eyedropper. Now if I play this, you can see instead of there being those halos, there's actually going to be the monkey heads in the viewport. Now they're really small right now, so I can change the scale, so I can turn up the scale. Now they're going to be a lot bigger, and I can also turn up the random scale, and that's really useful for just making it look a bit more random. And if you turn up the random scale, it's just going to make some of them smaller, but it's not going to make any of them bigger. Now you can also choose a collection of objects instead. So what I'm going to do is just scale down this cube, stick it over here, and then let's also go to the add menu, and I'm just going to add like a cone. We'll scale the cone down and put it over here. So now what I can do is select all these objects, hit the M key, and make sure I put them in a new collection. Let's just call this objects. So this collection is going to be called objects. Now if I click back here to go to the particle settings, instead of render as object, we can choose collection, and then here on the instance collection, we can choose the objects collection. Now when I play this, you can see it's going to randomly find different objects and generate different objects which are inside that object collection. Now if I turn on the whole collection button, that is going to add them all how they are in the collection. So you can see because all of these objects are aligned just like this, they're aligned here in the collection. If I click back here and turn on whole collection, they're all going to be emitted out together as if they're one object. So you can see they're all lined up. If I like duplicate this, you can see what that's doing. But instead, I like to just turn this off, and that was just going to randomly pick different objects. And I also like to turn on pick random. That just makes it a bit more random by choosing the pick random. Now you can also turn on the global coordinates, and this is going to move it by the global coordinates. So that way, if I select the object and move it, it's going to move it to the position where it is. So because this object is kind of offset. It's not in the very center of the scene. It's also going to be offset from the emitter object. So not very useful for most things. I wouldn't use it. So I'll just turn on the global coordinates. You can also use the object coordinates if you want to, and the object coordinates is very useful because this way if I rotate the objects in the collection, you can see they're also going to move in the particle settings. So that can be really useful. And then also there's object scale. This is useful to turn on because you can see now if I scale this, it's actually going to scale the particles as well. Whereas if I just have it turned off, now if I try to scale these objects, they're not actually going to be scaled, so the scale isn't going to change unless I scale them up and then press Control A and apply the scale. That will affect the scale. So applying the scale will affect it, but if you just want it to automatically adjust, you can turn on object scale. And now if I just scale this, that's going to change the size of the particles. Now there's also this show emitter button, and if I turn it off, that is going to hide this object from the render. So if I just go to the add menu, I'm just going to add a camera. If I now hit F12 to render the scene, you can see the particles are still there, but the sphere is gone. Whereas if I select the sphere, go here to the particles and turn on the show emitter, now if I render this again, that object is still going to show up. So this is really useful. I use it a lot because if you just want the particles to be emitting out of something, but you don't actually want to see the object, you can just turn that off. Now I can also turn on the use count settings. So if I click on use count, I can just click on this object here like the cube and I can turn up the count. Now if I play this, if I turn up to like 27, now there's going to be mostly cubes and there's just going to be a few of the other objects. Let's just turn the count down to like 0. Now you can see there's not going to be any cubes, or if I just turn it up to like 1, there's just going to be some randomly. So depending on the count, there's going to be more or less of the objects. So let's close the render, and the next setting that I want to go over is the rotation. So I mentioned earlier that we were going to go over the rotation later in the video. So let's now drag the rotation here, right here underneath the render, and we'll open it up and just turn it on. So now that we've actually added objects here, we can actually use the rotation. So if I just want to randomize the rotation, I can just turn up the randomize. I can also turn up the phase and the random phase, and that way the rotation is going to be much more random. Now, if I want them to rotate during an animation, I can also turn on the dynamic, and this will actually affect the animation. So with the dynamic turned off, when they bounce off of the object, they're not going to rotate. However, if I turn the dynamic back on, now if I play this, you can see they're going to rotate a bit when they hit the object. So if you just take a look at this monkey head, you can see it rotates as it's hitting into the object. Now let's say you want the particles to automatically be rotating when they're emitted out. Well, to do this, you need to turn on the angular velocity, and you need to make sure the dynamic is turned on, and then you can turn up this amount here. So if I turn this up, now you can see as they're coming out, they're already going to be spinning around. So this is very useful if you're, for example, making like falling leaves, and you want the leaves to look like they're rotating around, being blown around by the wind as they're falling. And that's exactly what I did in my falling leaves tutorial. You can check out that tutorial with the link in the description. And in that tutorial, I used the particle system, and I used this angular velocity amount to make the leaves so they're rotating as they're falling down in the animation. Let's close the rotation now, and we're going to turn on viewport display instead. So on default, it's set to rendered, and for most things, you're probably just going to leave it as rendered, but maybe the animation is getting a little bit laggy in the viewport. Maybe these objects are a bit high poly. You could, for example, just change it to like point, and now it's just going to show with these little halo objects where it is in the viewport. But then if you actually give this object a render, it's going to render with the actual objects that you've chosen. So again, the viewport display settings only changes what you can see in the viewport. Now you can also turn off the show emitter, and so by turning this off, you can see that the sphere here is now hidden from the view. This isn't actually going to affect the render. If you want to hide it from the render, you need to go to the render settings and turn off the show emitter. So there's a show emitter for both the viewport and the render. So just keep that in mind. But I'm just going to keep this one on, and on the render, I'll keep it off. Now you can also drag this amount here to show less of them. So for example, if you have a really big particle simulation and it's getting kind of laggy in the viewport, you could turn down the amount here, and now there's just going to be less in the viewport. So let's close the viewport display, and we're going to open up the children next. Now for the children, this is more useful when you're using the hair particles, so we're actually going to come back to this. But if I just turn this to simple, just to show you for an example, it's going to basically duplicate the object and have more of them right next to it. So it's basically making a copy of the object. So right here, there's a monkey head. I know there's like a bunch of monkey heads right next to each other. So I really don't find this useful for emitting objects. The children settings is much more useful when you're adding hair, because you can turn it to simple or interpolated, and that's going to add more hair strands next to a hair strand. Let's open up the next one here, which is the field weights. So with the field weights, you have all the different settings like the gravity settings and the force field and the wind and all the other settings. So on default, there's gravity in the 3D scene, but if I turn the gravity down, now as they're emitted out, they're just going to stay where they are. So for example, I could just like go right up here, open up the velocity and turn up the normal velocity, and now they just kind of look like maybe they're floating around in space because there isn't any gravity. So they're being emitted out by the direction of the normal, but the gravity isn't affecting them at all. So they look like they're just flying off into space. So let's turn that back down to 0. Let's go here to the field weights, and I can just turn on the gravity a little bit. So if you turn on the gravity a little bit, now they're going to fall, but they're going to fall slower. Now, as well as gravity, there's many different force fields. So if I just go to the add menu, you can go down here to force field, and you can see there's a bunch of different force fields. Let's just add wind because this is a very basic one. So I'll add wind. So I can just move the wind object, I can scale it, and I'll just rotate it over. And then also let's hit M, and we're just going to move it out here into the scene collection. So it's not inside any of the other collections. Now, if you select the wind object, you can click here to go to the physics, and I can just turn up the strength. So if I turn up the strength, those circles are going to get farther and farther apart, and that's showing you how strong the wind is. So now when I play this, you can see the wind is really strong, so it's blowing the particles away. However, I can change how strong the wind is affecting the particles. So if I select the particles, and let's go back to the particle settings, let's scroll down here. So I need to find the correct one, so I need to go down here until I find wind. So here's wind. So now if I turn the wind down, now the wind isn't affecting the particles as much. Now there's also this all setting, so if I turn this one down, it's also going to make the wind not be affecting it because this one is controlling all of them at once. And so while we're on the topic of the field weights, let's go over the different force field settings. Now I'm not going to go over all of them, I'm just going to go over the main ones that you need to know as a beginner, and the main ones that I find the most useful. So we already went over wind, so if I go to force field, the wind is super useful. You can rotate the wind, and the arrow is going to be the way which the wind is pointing. You can also go here to the physics, and then you can turn up the strength of the wind, and so the circles are going to represent how strong the wind is. Let's add another one, so if I go to the add menu, I'll go here to force field, and let's choose the force. So for this one, it's just going to push the objects away from itself. So if I just turn up the strength here to make it really strong, you can see it's just pushing the objects away. Let's delete this one, and I want to show you another one which is really useful. If I go here to force field on the add settings, let's add a vortex. So this one's really cool. Let's scale this one up and kind of stick it here in the center. And so this one is kind of going to act like a tornado. So if I just play the animation now, you can see they're almost like being sucked into the tornado. Let me just turn the strength up so it's actually kind of pulling them a lot stronger. So you can see it's going to act like a tornado. It's going to kind of spin the objects around towards the center, but the gravity is still affecting it. So they're still falling down as they're moving because the gravity is still pulling them down. And we'll delete this one, and another one which I want to show you under force field is going to be the turbulence. So this one is going to add a lot of noise to the simulation. So if I just stick this right here, and then let's just turn up the strength. We'll turn up the strength even stronger so you can see what it's doing. So now you can see as they're kind of coming out, they look like they're kind of blowing around randomly and kind of being pushed around. So that's what the turbulence does. So it's great for adding a lot of randomization. So the next part of the particle settings that I want to show you is how to distribute objects on another object. Now, since the geometry nodes feature has been added into Blender, it's a lot easier to use geometry nodes and you can get a much better result. So I'd recommend checking out these videos which I created. You can find the links to them in the description, and they show you how to distribute objects on another object using geometry nodes. So for example, distributing maybe grass and rock objects on a plane. However, I'm just going to show you right now how to do it with the particle system if you want to. So I'm just going to delete these extra objects. Let's maybe scale this up, and we're just going to go to the particles and delete the particles. Let's click on the plus here to add new particles. So on default, of course, it's going to be particles which are going to fall down. So instead of using emitter, we're going to use hair instead. So this is going to add the hair particles. But instead of having them be pieces of hair, we can choose to make them an object or collection instead. So let's close the field weights. We're going to open up render, and on the render as, it's set to path for hair. We can choose object or we can choose collection. So let's choose collection, and then here on the collection, just like we did before, we can click on the collection and choose a collection of objects, or we can just choose one object. And now you can see this distributed on to the object. And of course, with the emission here, you can like turn up the number here if you want to add more of them. You can also choose the distribution, so like jittered or random, like what we went through earlier. Here on the emission form, you can also choose vertices, volume, and if I choose volume, you're going to see that they're actually inside the object, or you can choose faces. And then there's also some other settings. We went over these already, like the whole collection, the global coordinates, and these different settings. settings. Now you can also go to the rotation, so let's close the render, close the emission, but to use the rotation we need to first click on advanced on the hair settings. So choose advanced and now we can turn on the rotation. So now here on the rotation there's the rotation axis. You can choose the different rotation axes like global X, global Y, global Z to rotate around the objects. Or you can also use the phase here and the randomize just to kind of randomize the rotation on the objects. But since the geometry nodes feature has been added to Blender, the geometry nodes is a lot easier and you have a lot more customizable settings. But if you want to learn how to do it with geometry nodes, you can definitely check out the tutorials which I created. Links are in the description. So I'm now going to show you how to bake the simulation. So to bake the simulation, I'm going to use this default particle system that we had at the starting where the objects just fall. Now there's a few reasons why you might want to bake the simulation. One reason why you might want to actually do a bake of the simulation is if it's really laggy in the viewport. It might be laggy if there's a lot of topology or there's a lot of particles. It might be kind of laggy. So if you bake it, then it's already going to bake the movement of the objects, so it doesn't have to try to move the objects and simulate it in real time. The other reason why you might want to bake a simulation is before rendering. It can be really useful to bake the simulation before you do the rendering, because I found that if you don't bake the simulation, sometimes when you're actually rendering out an animation, the bake can just stop working or stop moving, and so then you'll have to re-render your animation because it might get messed up. So let's close the emission here, let's close the rotation, and we're going to open up the cache here. Let's just drag this up kind of to the top so I can see it better. And there's a few different settings. So right here there's a bake setting, so I can click on this and it's just going to bake the simulation. So it went through and baked it, and now you can see because I clicked on bake, the red line here is always there, and I can move this around, and even if I try to like move the object, you can see the bake is still going to be there. So this is super useful. And also if you save the Blender file and close it, the bake data is still going to be there. Now after you bake the simulation, you can see many of these settings are going to be grayed out. Not all the settings are going to be grayed out. I can still like change the scale of the objects, but many of these settings are going to be gray. So to change them again, I have to click on delete bake, and then I can change the settings and rebake it. Now let's just say I'm over here in the animation and I just want to bake to where my view is. So where that little blue line there is in the timeline, I can click on calculate to frame. So I'll just move like right here, calculate to frame. It's just going to bake it to this frame. So if I just want to do like a still render, I could just bake to this frame and then give it a render. Now if I just delete the bake and then play this, you can see it's going to create that temporary bake in the viewport. But if this temporary bake is how I like it, I can click on current cache to bake, and this way it'll turn it into a hard bake. So now when I play this, move it around, even if I move the object around, the bake is still going to be there. So that's really useful. Now if you have multiple simulations, you can use these settings here. So for example, I'll make a new simulation. Now if I play this, you can see there's two simulations. Well, if I just click on bake, it's only going to bake the one which is selected. However, if I use this button here, the bake all dynamics, it's going to go through and bake both of them. So now if I click between both particles, you can see they are both baked. So that's really useful if you have multiple particle systems and you just want to bake them all at once. You can also click on this button to delete all bakes. And then the last setting here is if you're like at frame 200, maybe you just want to calculate it to frame 200, you can just click on update all the frames and it's just going to go through and bake up to frame 200. So these settings here are useful for baking one particle system at a time, and these are useful for baking all of them at once if you have multiple ones. So I'm going to delete both of these particles because I'm now going to show you how to add hair. So let's just click here to add a new particle system, and this one, instead of emitter, we're going to change it to hair instead, and we'll go over the hair settings. Now to use more advanced features with the hair, we can click on the advanced button, and that's going to give us some more advanced settings. So if I open up the emission here, it's going to work pretty similar to the other particle systems with the emitter. So you can see there's a number here, so I can turn that up. And so if I just go into the rendered viewport mode, just to show you, if I kind of zoom in here, you can see the hair actually does have some thickness, but in the solid view, it doesn't really look like it has any thickness, but it will have thickness in the final render. So there's the number of hairs. You can also change the seed if you just don't like where they are. And then there's also this hair length. So that's pretty self-explanatory. You could make really small hairs or bigger hairs. Now the segments is basically going to be the quality of the hairs. So it's basically like you're subdividing the hairs. So the hairs, if I want them to be very detailed, going back and forth here along the hair, I could turn this up or turn it down, and we'll be playing around with this setting later, because right now you can't really see the difference. You can't really see the difference of the quality because they're all just pointed up in one direction. But for now, I'll leave the segments to 5. Now here under source, we have the source settings, and we can choose faces. So this way the hair is going to grow out of the faces. faces, or I can use volume. And so this way the hair is actually going to be inside the center there of the object, or I can also use vertices, and I can see each hair is just coming out of the vertex. But for most things, faces is the most useful. There's also jittered and random, and I think random looks pretty nice, but you could also use jittered. So we'll close this setting, and let's open up the hair dynamics here at the bottom. And we're going to check mark the hair dynamics. So if you turn on hair dynamics, this way the hair is actually going to interact in an animation. So if I go to the starting and play this, hit the spacebar to play, you can see the hair is going to naturally fall down using the gravity. Or if you don't want the hair to interact with any animation, just turn that off, and now it's not going to interact with the animation. But I'm going to turn the hair dynamics on just by checking that check mark there. Now there's a quality step, so if I want to be more higher quality, I could turn this way up, but you can see it's going to be quite a bit more laggy in the viewport, or if I turn it way down, it won't be quite as realistic, but that actually looks pretty good, and that way it's faster in the viewport. Now I can also change the pin goal strength, and this is going to make it more stiff. You can see if I turn it way down, it's kind of smooth, or if I turn this way up, now when I play this, the hair is going to be pretty smooth and retain its similar shape. Now, because the hair is interacting with the animation using the hair dynamics, I can use the other force field settings just like I did earlier. So for example, I can go to the add menu, go to force field, let's add like a wind here, maybe rotate the wind. Let's go to the wind settings and turn up the strength. And now if I play the animation, the wind is actually affecting the hair. And let's turn up the noise amount. So now the wind is going to look more noisy. So it kind of looks like the hair is just like blowing in the wind. I could also delete this one. Let's add another one. Let's maybe add like a vortex, bring this into the center. And now you can see the vortex is kind of spinning around the hair. Now, if you want the hair to interact with an object, you can do that. So if I go to the add menu, let's just add a mesh. We'll add a UV sphere. And I'm just going to stick the UV sphere here inside the hair. Now right now if I play this, it's not interacting with the sphere. So to make it interact with the hair, we need to select this object, and we need to again go to the physics and turn on collision. Now if I play this, you can see it's actually going to push around the hair. So if I kind of move this down here, you can see it's pushing the hair around. Now real quick, I'm going to go back to an earlier setting which I talked about earlier. So if I go here to the particle settings, let's go here to the emission, and I talked about the segments. So you can see if I turn the segments way down, they're not going to have very many segments, so they're not going to be very detailed. However, if I turn the segments way up, maybe to like, I don't know, a 15, now if I go back to the starting and play this, you can see they're going to have a lot more detail. So it's basically how subdivided the hairs are, but it's also going to make it more laggy, so you shouldn't turn up too high. I'm just going to leave it at the default of 5. Now if I go back to the hair dynamics, we have the quality steps. So if I turn this up, it's going to be a higher quality animation, but you can see now it's quite laggy in the viewport. Now the pin goal strength, this is going to again make it more stiff. So you can see if I now move this around, it is interacting with it. It is pushing the hair around, but not quite as much. Let's turn the pin strength down, maybe to just like a 10, something like that. Now if I play this, you can see if I move around the sphere, it is going to push the hair around a little bit, but not too much. And then if I open up the collision settings, we again have a quality. So this will add more quality. So let me just turn this up a bit bigger. So it's going to be higher quality. It's a little bit hard to notice, but if you turn it up too high, it will kind of start to get laggy. So I'm going to keep the quality down. And there's also a distance. So this distance, because it's under the collision tab, this is going to add more distance with any object it's interacting with. So if I just turn the distance up here, maybe just turn up to like a 1 or a 2. Now when I move this around, you can see it's kind of pushing around the hair a lot more because there's going to be more of a distance in between the object. So that looks a little bit better. I like turning up that distance a bit. Let's close the collisions and we can open up the structure. So if I turn up this vertex mask, that is going to make each one of the hairs heavier because we are controlling the mask. So now they fall down a lot more because they're heavier, or I could just keep it at a 1 or maybe even less. So the hair is really light. So that's going to change the heaviness of the hair. You can also turn up the stiffness value. So now you can see the hair is quite stiff. And even if I move this around, kind of push the hair around, it pretty much stays in its same shape. Now, if I turn up this random here, this is going to randomize the stiffness. So let's make it a bit more stiff, but then I'll turn the random way up. So this is really cool. I think it gives a really natural look because it's pretty stiff. Some of the hairs are stiff, but then because the random is really high, some of it is more stiff and some of it is less stiff. So that makes some of the hairs stand up a lot more, but then other hairs kind of fall down. Now, we already talked about this earlier, but there is a cache. So if I open up the cache here, I can choose a simulation start and simulation end, and this will show up if you're using hair and advanced. And also you need to make sure that you're actually using the hair dynamics. So turn that on so you can do an animation. So you can choose a simulation start and a simulation end. And then again, you can use all the same settings, which we talked about earlier, to bake the simulation. So this is going to bake the hair simulation. So let's close the cache, and the next one that I'm going to open up is the physics. So again, we have this weight value, so this weight I can turn up, and that's going to make the hair heavier. So if I turn this up to a really big value, the hair is going to be quite a bit heavier. Now under physics, if I open up the forces, we have this Brownian, and this Brownian is going to add more randomness to the hair. So that's maybe a little bit too big, and maybe just turn it down a little bit, but now you can see the hair is going to look a lot more fuzzy. If I go into the kind of rendered view, let's just add a quick material. So I'm just going to add a material, let's just make it like a red material. So you can kind of see that the hair is a lot more fuzzy and kind of random, and it's been ruffled up a little bit. So let's close the physics, and let's go down here to children. Let's open up the children settings. So what the children is going to do is it's going to basically duplicate the hairs and add more of the same hairs next to a single hair. So it's sort of like it's going to make a clone of that hair. And the children option can be really useful for adding lots of hair without making the scene too laggy. Because of course you could go to the emission and you could turn up the number way up, but if you turn the number up to a really high value, then it might get kind of laggy. So I'm going to turn the number down, maybe to just like a 200, so there aren't that many hairs. But now I'm going to use the children's feature to add more hairs, basically clone the hairs that you already have. So we'll go down to children and we'll use simple. So if I use simple, you can see it's going to clone each hair, and so it's going to just stick it right next to it, kind of at a random point around it. But if I go into the rendered view, that doesn't look too realistic because every single hair has the same exact shape. So one of these objects is the real hairs, and then all the other ones are the children, and they're retaining the same exact shape. So instead of using simple, I'm going to use interpolated. And so interpolated is going to do pretty much the same thing, but each hair is going to have a bit more of a random shape. So again, if I go into rendered view, that looks quite a bit better and it looks more realistic. Now there's a lot of settings here on the children, and as I mentioned earlier, this can be very useful if you have a very fuzzy object or you want to add a lot of particles or a lot of hair, but you don't want it to get too laggy in the viewport. So this interpolated mode has this display amount and the render amount. So it's going to display as only 10%, but then it'll render as 100. I could turn this to 100, and now we have a really nice fuzzy sphere, but you can see it actually isn't too laggy in the viewport. But if you have lots of hair, you might want to turn the display amount down just so you can't see as many of the hairs. So I'm going to keep the display amount to just like a 10 for now. Now you can also change the length of the hair. So here on the emission setting, if I go up to the emission, you can change the length of the hair here with the hair length, but then if you're using interpolated, you have a new length setting you can play around with. Now there's also this threshold here. So let me just go back to the starting. So if I play around with the threshold, that is going to determine how many of the hairs are using the new hair length and how many of them are using the old hair length. So if I just turn the length down, now the interpolated is going to make all the hair really short. But if I turn up the threshold, that is going to make it so that some of the hairs are using this original size right here. Because you can see this has a size here with the emission, but then the interpolated has its own size. So that's kind of useful if you want to make some hairs longer and some hairs shorter. You can see some hairs are long, but most of them are pretty short. There's also a random seed here, so if you just don't like how it is, you can of course adjust the random seed. Now there's also a bunch more useful settings with the children to make it look a lot more interesting. So if I turn up the parting here, you can see the hairs are going to be pointed in similar directions. So you can see they're kind of clumping together a bit more, or I can keep it down. I like keeping it down because it looks a bit more random. There's also clumping here, so I can turn up the clump, and you can see that the endpoints are kind of going to clump together more. Now I can also drag the shape around, so if I wanted to make it kind of look like a pointy piece, I could turn that shape down. Now you can see that they're all pointed together kind of like a cone shape. I can also add some noise to the clumping by turning on the clump noise. So let's just turn this up a bit, and now you can see it looks a bit more random. Now instead of turning the clumping up, if I drag it all the way down to 0 and then start to drag it into a negative value, instead of it clumping at the very top, it's going to clump at the bottom. So this is probably a lot more useful by turning the clumping to -1 instead of 1, because this way it kind of looks like some little bits of grass or clumps of grass or some plants which are kind of coming out of the object. Now there's also a really cool kink setting, so let's close these. We'll open up the kink here, and the kink type has some different presets. So for example, there's curl. This will make the hair kind of move around and curl a bit, and there's a lot of different settings you can play around with to kind of play around with the curl, like the flatness and the frequency, so that's pretty cool. You can make it more wavy. And there's a bunch more here, like the radial one, and each one of these have settings. You can choose the scale, you can choose the wave one and kind of make it look a bit more wavy. So these are really useful for changing the look of the hair. You can also use like braid, that's pretty cool, and just play around with a lot of the settings. And there's also a spiral. Let's close the children, and I'm now going to go down here to the hair shape. So we'll open up the hair shape. And so the first setting is this strand shape. So if it's 0, you can see it's a lot more thick over the entire hair, but then it gets thin at the very end. If I just turn this way down, you can see it's going to be a lot more thinner as it gets closer to the top. So it's a lot more thinner overall, but then it still gets thick at the very end. And there's also the root and the tip, and this is going to be the size of the hair. So if I make the root a lot thicker, you can see where the hairs are coming out from the object. They're going to be really thick, but they'll still get pretty thin. Or I can turn this down, and let's instead try the tip. So I can turn up the tip, and that way the tip is going to be way thicker, but you can see at the very end, it's still going to be really sharp. Now I can click on this closed tip and turn that off, and this way they're going to look a bit more like noodles, because with the closed tip off, they're going to retain that same thickness of the tip there. But I like keeping closed tip on usually for most things, so they come to a point there no matter how big the tip is. Now we already talked about the field weights earlier in the video, but the field weights act exactly the same. So for example, I could just open up the field weights and turn the gravity down, and now the hair is going to be affected less by the gravity. I could also go here to the add menu. Let's go to force field, and I'll just add a wind, and I'll move the wind over here. Let's go to the settings and just turn the wind up. So now you can see the hair is going to be blown by the wind. But if I go back to the particle settings, to the field weights, I can turn the wind down, and now the wind is going to be affecting it less. Now another cool setting with the hair is that you can add a texture which will control where the hair is. So let's open up the textures here, open up this textures tab. We'll then just click on new to add a new texture, and to edit the texture we can click on this button here, and this button is going to just go over to the texturing panel. So let's now go up here to the type, and instead of image or movie, I can choose like clouds instead. Now I can change some of the settings, so let's just maybe scale it up, and we'll maybe turn the soft to hard. You can just play around with the settings, but now to actually make it affect the hair, we need to open up the influence settings. So you can just click on these check marks here to turn on whatever texture you want to affect the hair. So for example, I am going to turn on the density. So if I turn on density and then go here and change the size, now the hair is just going to show up in some areas. So the white and black values of the texture is going to determine where the hair is going to show up. Let's add some more hair. So if I go back here to the particles, let's just turn the number up so you can kind of see it better. And now you can see that they're kind of just coming out in little clumps because the texture is affecting where it's coming out. If I go back to the texturing panel, there's some other things here, like you could choose the size or use the density. I think the density is the most useful one. And there's also a threshold. So if you just want it to affect the density a little bit, I could just turn this up, and now it just looks a bit more noisy and random. So some parts have less hairs and some parts have more. And if you want to make it more contrasted, you can scroll all the way down here to colors, and then you can turn on the brightness or the contrast. So let's make it really contrasty, turn the contrast way up. So you can see here's the texture, it's mostly black with some little white bits. So now you can see just in some areas the hair is coming out of the object. So the next feature that I'll show you is how you can comb the hair. So if you just select the object with the particles, if you click here on object mode, there is actually a particle edit, and it has that comb icon. So I can go into particle edit, and now I actually have some brushes and I can actually comb the hair. So this is very useful if you maybe have a character and you want to comb the hair on a character. So I'll hit the T key to open up the side panel, and you can see there's going to be a bunch of different brush settings. And then here you can also see there's a strength and a radius, so I can drag those. And now I can just go along here, maybe even turn the strength down a little bit, and I can just start to comb the hair. So I can just make the hair kind of falling down, kind of like that. Maybe bring it down like that. All right, bring it over there. And then there's a bunch of different useful tools like the smooth. So if I want to just smooth some areas, I could just kind of smooth that out. It's going to kind of straighten it out. And then you can also use this button to add more hair. So this is really cool because you can add hair to specific areas. So you could add it onto like a character's head. So if I choose add, now I can just click in random points, click along here on the top of the character's head, and you can see I can actually manually add more hair to just that area. Then I could go back to comb, and I could just comb that new bit of hair that I've added. So let's just comb that down like that. I could also go to the smooth brush or the smooth tool and just kind of smooth out the hair. Now there's also a length option. So if I choose length, I can grow different parts of the hair. So if I want this part of the hair to be a lot longer, I can just go along here, just click and drag, and that's going to make just those hair a bit longer. And then I can go back to the comb and I can just comb the longer bits of hair. Then there's also a puff. So this is useful for just kind of puffing it up. If they're kind of too far on top of each other, I can just go along here and puff up the hair a little bit. And then there's also a scissors, so I can use this to cut. So if some of the hair is a bit too long, I can just go along here and just give my character a nice little haircut. So maybe right down here, maybe give him a shave. If this was the character's face, just kind of cut some of those hairs there and maybe make these hairs a little bit smaller. And let's just click on particle edit and we can go back to object mode. And you can see because I went back to object mode, it's now showing us the children. So if I just close the emission here, close the hair shape, just close these settings, you can see if I go back to object mode, it's going to show us the children that we added, the interpolated children. So that's why there's more hairs. And then also this display amount, I could just turn this to like 100. So let's just go into the rendered viewport mode to kind of see how that's looking. And there we go. So we now have some thick hair, and this could be like added on a character's head. Now, after you comb the hairs, if I go right up here, you can see that some of the options are grayed out. So this one is grayed out here, so I couldn't add more hairs. So if the options are grayed out and you want to go back and change some of the settings, you're going to need to click on the delete edit. So if you do click on the delete edit, it's going to get rid of the combing that you've done. So if I click on delete, now the combing's gone. So I'd have to go back into the particle edit and I have to re-comb the particles. So I'd recommend changing all the settings to the settings that you like before you actually go into the particle edit and comb the hairs. And then finally, to finish up this tutorial, I'm going to show you how you can add a different material to just the hair. So if I just zoom in here close up to the sphere, you can see I just added a very simple red material to the sphere. And on default, the hair is going to use the same material as the object that it's coming out of. But what I could do here is just create a new material. So I'll just click on the plus here to create a new material. Let's click on new, and I could just like rename this to hair. And then one thing that which you can actually do is you can click on this little principled shader here, and you could change this to principled hair BSDF if you wanted to. So principled hair, and this is going to have like a bunch of different settings to create hair. Like there's a color here, you can see it's brown, and there's some different settings like the roughness. So you could do that if you want to, or you can just use whatever material you want for the hair. Now the sphere is the red color, but I want the hair to be the new hair brown color. So to do this, we're going to go back here to the particles, and we're going to close the emission, and let's open up the render. And here on render, you can see on default, it's going to use the first material which was added to the object. But I can instead change this to hair. So now you can see we have just a nice basic brown color to our hair, but the sphere is still going to be red. And with that finished, this is going to wrap up this tutorial on how to use Blender's particle system for beginners. So I hope you found this video helpful, and thank you for watching. And if you'd like to get more into particle systems and actually learn how to create some finished renders and animations with the particle systems, then I highly recommend checking out my particle systems tutorial playlist, where I have lots more tutorials on how to use the particle systems to create some cool things in Blender, like a confetti animation, falling leaves. You can also learn how to create fuzzy fabric. I also have a tutorial on how to create falling animated snow. I also have a tutorial on how to create fireworks, and I also have a tutorial on how to create a fuzzy sphere. So you can check out all those videos by going to my particle system playlist linked in the video description. And if you'd like to help support me and this YouTube channel, a great way to do that is by checking out my Gumroad store and my Patreon page. And on my Gumroad and Patreon, you can get access to lots of Blender content like 3D models and assets, tutorial files, artwork project files, procedural materials, geometry node modifier setups, and lots more Blender content on my Gumroad and Patreon. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and thank you for watching.